The creek behind his house had always been a quiet part of his life. It was not big, not deep, and not dangerous. It was simply a small stream of water that passed through the land the same way it had for decades. He grew up seeing it, and even before he bought the house, the creek had been a part of the property. It came from farther up the hill, moved through his yard, and then continued into the small woods behind the neighborhood. Most days, the sound of the water was barely noticeable, more like a soft whisper. On rainy days, it grew louder, but still stayed calm. It was something he had always liked. When the woman next door moved in, everything changed. He had hoped they would get along. He didn't expect them to become close friends or anything like that, but he hoped for a simple, respectful relationship between neighbors. Instead, from the day she arrived, there was tension in the air. He tried greeting her when she first moved in, but she only gave him a sharp look and walked away. He didn't think too much about it at that moment. Moving in could be stressful, and maybe she was having a long day. But he soon found out that this was not the case. This was simply the kind of person she was. A few days after she moved in, he saw her standing at the edge of her yard, staring at the creek with her hands on her hips. She looked annoyed, as if the water itself had offended her. He walked over to say hello again, thinking maybe he could help if she had a question about the neighborhood. But before he could say anything, she spoke with a firm, almost accusing tone. "Is this your creek?" she asked, pointing at the flowing water. He didn't even know how to respond at first. The creek wasn't something anyone owned. It simply ran through both their properties. So he explained gently, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's a natural creek," he said. "It's been here for a long time. No one really owns it. It just passes through." She frowned as if that was the wrong answer. "Well, it's causing water to run onto my land," she replied sharply. "You need to do something about that." He blinked, confused. "Water is supposed to run through here," he said. "That's what the creek has always done. It actually helps prevent bigger flooding." She shook her head in frustration. "I don't want water in my yard," she said. "It makes the ground soft. I moved here for peace, not a swamp." He looked around. Her yard wasn't even wet. The creek stayed inside its little path, and the ground on both sides was dry. He tried to explain that the creek didn't cause any harm, but she interrupted him again. "I'm telling you right now," she said, pointing her finger toward him. "If this creek messes up my property, it will be on you. I'm not dealing with this." And with that, she walked back into her house. He stood there, a little stunned. Never in his life had he met someone who seemed angry at a stream of water. He tried to brush it off. Maybe she would calm down once she settled into the neighborhood. Maybe she just needed time. But that hope didn't last long. Within the first week, she walked over 2 more times, complaining about the creek. One time she claimed it looked too full. Another time she said the sound of the water was too loud, even though it was barely a trickle that day. He didn't want to argue, so he kept explaining things calmly, hoping she would eventually understand. But she didn't want explanations. She wanted someone to blame, and for some reason, she chose him. A few days later, she started accusing him directly. She stood near the property line, arms crossed, telling him that he was allowing water to cross into her land. He tried to explain again that this was simply how nature worked, but she didn't want to hear it. "You need to fix it," she said. "This is your problem." He tried to stay patient. "I can't change where a creek goes," he said. "No one can. And even if I tried, it would be illegal. We both have to leave it as it is." She gave him a look filled with disbelief and irritation. "So you're saying you won't do anything?" she snapped. He sighed quietly. "I'm saying I can't." She turned around and stormed back into her house without another word. After that, she stopped trying to talk to him and instead started complaining to other people. He would catch her talking loudly to neighbors who walked by, pointing toward his property and shaking her head. They looked uncomfortable, not wanting to get involved. A couple of them later came to him privately and said not to worry, that they knew the creek had always been there. Still, it was clear that she was determined to turn something harmless into a fight. Weeks passed, and her frustration only grew. She seemed to watch the creek every day, waiting for something to go wrong so she could blame him again. One morning, after a small rain shower, She came outside and shouted across the yard. "This is getting worse," she yelled. "My yard is softer than before. This is on you." Her yard was perfectly fine. But he was tired of arguing, so he simply said, "If you think something is wrong, you can call the city. They can check it." He didn't expect her to actually do it, but of course she did. A city worker arrived a few days later to check the area. The worker walked around, looked at the creek, measured a few things, and then told both of them that everything was normal. The creek was functioning the way a natural waterway should. It was not harming anyone. There was no violation, and no changes were allowed. He felt relieved, thinking that the official word would finally end the argument. But she became even more upset. Instead of accepting it, she claimed the city worker didn't know what he was talking about and insisted that she was being treated unfairly. She said someone was protecting him. The city worker calmly repeated that everything was fine, then left. For a few days, she stayed quiet. He thought maybe she had finally given up the fight, but instead she was just planning something else. One evening, he heard voices near the creek and saw a group of workers on her side of the yard. They were unloading tools from a truck, lining up bags of material, and preparing to build something. He walked over to ask what was happening, but she stepped forward before he could speak. "I'm fixing the problem," she said sharply. "Since you won't do it, I will." He looked at the workers, then back at her. "What are you building?" he asked. "A barrier," she said proudly. "To stop water from coming into my yard." He felt his stomach drop. "You can't do that," he said. "You can't block a natural creek. That's not legal. It will cause worse problems." She laughed in a mocking way. "I know the law better than you," she said. "I've already looked into it. This is my property, and I can protect it however I want." And he tried again. "Please don't do this. You're going to cause flooding. The water needs a place to go. If you don't like it," she said, "call someone." "I'm not listening to you anymore." He stepped back, feeling both worried and frustrated. He didn't want to argue with her in front of the workers, and he knew she wouldn't listen anyway. He decided to take pictures of what they were building just in case things went wrong. He didn't want trouble, but he also needed proof that she was doing something dangerous. That night, he sat on his porch thinking about the whole situation. He didn't want a feud. He didn't want drama. He simply wanted peace in the home he loved. But now, because she didn't understand how nature worked, things were becoming more stressful. He hoped that maybe the barrier would at least stay stable, even though he knew it would cause problems when the rain came, and the rain was coming. The forecast showed several storms in the next week. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the creek that had always been so quiet and harmless. He never imagined someone would try to block it. He never imagined the situation would get this far. But deep down, he felt an uneasy feeling growing. Something told him this was only the beginning. He did not know yet that the creek he had always respected would soon show her a lesson she would never forget. He did not know that Mother Nature had her own way of correcting things. The peaceful days were almost over. None of them were ready for what was coming next. The workers finished most of the barrier by the next afternoon. It stood along the edge of her yard like a stubborn wall, blocking the creek from moving naturally. He watched from his side, not because he wanted to interfere, but because he felt uneasy about what was happening. The wall was made of thick concrete blocks, packed tightly together with extra material smeared into the gaps. It looked heavy, stiff, and completely unnatural compared to the soft shape of the creek that had flowed there for years. When the workers were done, they packed up and left. She stood outside, admiring the barrier the way someone might admire a new fence. She crossed her arms and nodded, pleased with herself. He thought about approaching her again, maybe one more time, to explain calmly that this wasn't going to work. But he knew she wouldn't listen. She had made up her mind, and anything he said would only make her more defensive. The next morning, the sky was cloudy. The weather report predicted light rain during the day and heavier rain in the evening. He felt nervous, but he tried not to let it consume his thoughts. He had lived there for years, and the creek had never given him trouble. As long as people didn't interfere with it, the water always found its way safely down the hill. That was the part she didn't understand. Around noon, the first drops of rain began falling. He sat on his porch, watching the small splashes form on the railing. The sound of the rain mixed with the usual quiet flow of the creek. He sipped his tea, trying to stay calm, though his mind kept drifting back to the barrier. He thought about calling the city again, but he knew they wouldn't come out for something like this right away, especially not during a storm. The rain grew heavier in the afternoon. He put on his jacket and walked to the side of his yard to check the creek. The water was rising a little, but nothing unusual. It did that every time it rained. The creek curved gently along its natural path, moving forward the way it always had. But then he looked at the barrier. The water reached it and had nowhere to go. It began pooling behind the wall, slowly filling her side of the yard. The grass around her home turned darker as it absorbed the moisture. The puddle grew wider and deeper, forming a shallow pool. She stepped outside holding an umbrella. Instead of worry, her face held a sort of determined pride, as if convinced she was stopping the water from reaching her yard even, though it was clearly gathering there already. She looked at him across the property line. "See?" She called out loudly over the sound of the rain. "The water is staying away from my yard now." He didn't know what to say. The water was literally filling her yard, but he didn't want to argue while rain poured down. He simply turned, went back to his porch, and sat down. Wondering how long it would take for her to realize what was happening, by late afternoon, the rain became steady. Not too heavy, but enough to make the creek swell a little more. He checked again. Her yard was now completely soaked. The water level behind the barrier had grown to almost half the height of the wall. It looked like a rising pond. She came outside again, but this time she didn't look confident. She stared at the water, then at the barrier, then at the sky. She walked back and forth nervously, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet grass. He could see the worry beginning to grow in her eyes as the rain continued. He went about his evening inside, trying to distract himself. He cooked dinner, washed dishes, and checked the windows. Every so often, he stepped outside to look at the creek, hoping the water wasn't rising too quickly. By evening, the storm finally arrived. The rain came down harder than before, steady and strong. The wind pushed the trees back and forth. He stood at his back steps, watching the rain as it pounded the yard. The creek on his side rose higher but still stayed within its banks, flowing normally. He walked closer to the barrier again, holding a flashlight. On her side, the water had risen to the top edge of the wall. The whole area behind it was a deep pool now. The reflection of the light danced across the surface. It was no longer a puddlet, it was a small lake. She ran outside wearing a raincoat, shouting, "This is too much. This is ridiculous. Why is this happening?" She walked quickly across her yard, splashing through several inches of water. She approached the barrier, pushing against it with her hands like she expected it to suddenly open. He felt bad for her, even though he had warned her so many times. He walked closer to the fence between them. "The water needs to flow," he shouted over the storm. "The creek has nowhere to go now. You blocked its path." She shook her head frantically. This wall was supposed to stop the water, not hold it. Her voice cracked with panic. "You need to do something." He shook his head slowly. "There's nothing I can do right now. The water is too high." She stomped away from the barrier, splashing through the water that reached her ankles. She disappeared inside her house and slammed the door behind her as he walked back to his porch. He felt a sinking feeling in his chest. The storm wasn't letting up. If the rain kept falling like this, the water behind the barrier would only rise higher, and the pressure on the wall would increase with every passing minute. By late night, the storm grew stronger. The sound of the rain filled the entire neighborhood. He lay in bed, but couldn't sleep. He kept imagining the barrier straining under the weight of the water. He knew it was only a matter of time before something happened. Around midnight, he heard a loud thump outside, followed by a strange, deep noise like something shifting under heavy weight. He got up quickly and went to the back window. Even through the sheets of rain, he could see it clearly. The water behind the barrier had reached the very top. It was overflowing slightly on her side. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight again and rushed outside. Standing near his yard, he saw the wall bulging ever so slightly. The pressure was too much. That was when he heard her again. She was standing inside her back door yelling into the night, "Do something. Help me. The water's going to flood the yard." He turned toward her. "You need to call emergency services," he shouted. "They're the only ones who can help now." She disappeared back inside, and he assumed she finally made the call. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless. He stood there for a minute, watching the water tremble against the wall. Then the unthinkable happened. A loud cracking sound filled the air. The barrier tilted slightly, just enough for a stream of water to burst through a small gap near the bottom. The stream quickly grew thicker, spraying water into her yard with intense force. The wall began to shake. He stepped back, knowing what was coming. The barrier couldn't hold any longer. With a deafening snap, a section of the wall gave out. Water exploded through the opening, rushing out like a released river. The pool behind the barrier emptied rapidly, sending a powerful surge of water toward her house. She screamed from inside as the water swept across her yard, pushing debris along with it. The rain only made it worse. The surge continued forward until it hit the side of her home. He watched helplessly, unable to do anything but witness the disaster unfold. Within minutes, the water piled up along the foundation. He saw it rising higher, reaching the basement windows. The pressure grew. The windows bowed inward. Then, with another loud crack, the glass broke. Water poured into her basement in a heavy rush, flooding the space instantly. Boxes, furniture, and belongings floated in the dark water as she yelled from somewhere inside her house. He felt a mix of worry, fear, and sadness. He didn't want this to happen. He didn't wish harm on her. But nature had reacted exactly the way he knew it would. He stood there in the storm, watching the water slowly settle after the barrier had collapsed. The creek on his side began to calm as it found its natural path again. The chaos was happening only on her side, caused by the very wall she had built to protect her yard. He turned and walked slowly to his house, soaked to the bone. Inside, he sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the distant sound of her shouting and the approaching sirens. He knew emergency workers would be there soon. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhausted from the long day. This was only the beginning of the problems she would face now. The storm had shown no mercy, and neither did the creek. He thought about how many times he had warned her, hoping to prevent exactly this situation. But she didn't want to listen, not to him, not to the city worker, not even to the rules of nature. Now, everything was different. And he knew that the next day would bring questions, blame, and consequences. He just didn't know how she would react to the truth that she had caused the very disaster she feared. The sound of sirens grew louder through the storm, cutting through the heavy rain like sharp echoes. He stood by his back window, exhausted, but unable to look away from the chaos outside. When the emergency truck finally arrived, bright lights swept across the yards, reflecting off the water that now covered most of her property. The flashing lights made everything feel more real, more urgent. The creek, the storm, the broken barrier, everything had led to this moment. He walked onto his porch, holding a small flashlight even though the rescue lights were bright enough. Rain still poured, though it was not as intense now. The air smelled of mud, wet earth, something heavy that felt like tension hanging over the neighborhood. The emergency team approached her house, shouting instructions as they moved through the ankle-deep water. One of them used a pole to check the depth as they walked toward the back. Another knocked on her door loudly, calling her name. She opened the door, her face pale and frantic. Her voice shook as she spoke to the rescuers, pointing wildly toward the backyard and then toward the basement door. "It's flooding. Everything is underwater," she shouted. They tried to calm her, but she kept talking, explaining her version of what had happened. He watched from a distance, feeling a strange mix of sympathy and frustration. He didn't want her to suffer. But everything unfolding now was exactly what he had feared. One of the rescuers saw him standing near his porch and walked over. His jacket soaked from the rain. "Did you see what happened?" the rescuer asked. He nodded slowly. "She built a barrier across the creek," he said. "The rain built up behind it, and the wall finally gave out. the water rushed straight to her basement. The rescuer let out a long sigh. "Natural waterways can't be blocked," he said. "This kind of thing happens when people try to stop water instead of letting it move." He nodded again. "I tried telling her," he said quietly. "She didn't want to listen." The rescuer thanked him for the information and went back to help the others. They directed her to step away from the basement door because the pressure made it unsafe. One of them radioed for additional help, explaining that the basement was already filled knee-deep with water and still rising from his porch. He could hear her blaming the storm, the creek, the neighborhood, anything except her own decision. "This shouldn't be happening," she shouted. "That creek is the problem. It has always been the problem." She continued to insist the creek itself was at fault. One of the emergency workers shook his head calmly. "Ma'am, the creek is not the problem," he said. "The barrier you built trapped the water. It had nowhere to go." Even then, she refused to accept it. "I put up that wall to protect my yard. How can you say this is my fault?" she yelled. The emergency worker didn't argue with her. He simply asked her to stand back so they could continue working. He felt a deep sadness watching everything unfold. No matter how stubborn she had been, it was painful to see her face filled with panic. The water had caused real damage. She was learning the consequences in the hardest way possible. The storm slowed to a steady drizzle by the time the rescue team finished checking her basement. The worst of the flooding had already happened. The water from behind the barrier had rushed into her yard, into her home, and finally out toward the lower parts of the street. They placed a pump at the basement entrance to remove the standing water, but the process would take hours. Neighbors slowly came outside, some holding umbrellas, others wrapped in jackets. They stood near their porches or under large trees, watching quietly. A few whispered to each other, surprised by the scene. Everyone had heard the loud crack earlier, the sound of the wall breaking. Everyone knew something big had happened. One neighbor, an older man who lived across the street, walked over to him. "I heard the noise and came out," the man said. "I saw the water going straight into her house. That wall she built didn't stand a chance." He nodded quietly. "She didn't want to listen," he said. "I told her the creek needed to be left alone." The older man sighed. "Sometimes people don't learn until nature teaches them," he said softly. "Water is stronger than people think. You can't trap it." He knew the man was right. He had always respected the creek because he understood that nature had its own rules. You couldn't fight those rules without consequences. After a while, the emergency workers spoke to her about what would happen next. They told her she would need to report the damage to her insurance. They explained that the barrier she built was considered an unapproved alteration of a natural waterway. She stared at them in disbelief as they continued speaking. One worker made it clear, "You will need to remove the remaining portion of that. The city will want it gone." She looked like she wanted to argue again, but the exhaustion and shock on her face kept her quiet. For the first time since she moved in, she stood speechless. He watched from a distance, unsure if he should feel sorry for her or frustrated that things had escalated this far. Part of him felt bad that she was facing such a stressful night. But another part of him remembered all the warnings she ignored as the workers finished up and the lights from the emergency vehicle dimmed. He finally walked back inside his home. He peeled off his wet jacket, washed the mud from his shoes, and sat down at his kitchen table. The house felt warm and quiet compared to the storm outside, but his mind was restless. He couldn't help replaying everything that had happened over the past week. Every argument, every warning, every moment she insisted she was right. He never wanted conflict with her. He only wanted her to understand that nature is not something you could control by building a wall. He wondered how she was doing now. Part of him wanted to check on her, but he knew she was surrounded by emergency workers and likely in no mood to talk to him. He stayed where he was, listening to the slow drip of rain on his windows. A few hours later, the pumps finally removed most of the water from her basement. The emergency workers packed up their equipment, leaving behind only the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off puddles. One of them walked over to his porch again. "We've done what we can tonight," the worker said. "The rest is up to the city inspectors tomorrow. They'll want statements." He nodded. I understand. Get some rest, the worker added gently. It's been a long night for everyone. He thanked him before stepping back inside. He finally tried to lie down, hoping for a few hours of sleep, but his thoughts refused to settle. Images of the broken wall and the rushing water kept returning to his mind. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him into a light, uneasy sleep. When he woke up the next morning, the storm had passed completely. The sky was clear, washed clean by the long night of rain. The air felt fresh, though the ground was still damp. He stepped outside, taking in the quiet calm that always followed a heavy storm. He walked toward the creek. On his side, the water had already returned to its normal level, flowing gently the way it always did. On her side, the broken pieces of the wall lay scattered across the muddy ground. Her yard still held puddles, but most of the water had drained down the natural slope. She stood outside too, looking at the mess. Her face looked tired, her eyes puffy from the long night. She glanced toward him but didn't say anything. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked lost. He approached slowly, stopping near the property line. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything in my basement?" "Ruined," he nodded. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "I tried to warn you." She looked away, almost ashamed. "I didn't think it would get this bad," she said. "I thought the wall would protect my yard." "Nature doesn't work like that," he said gently. "Water needs a path. When you block it, it finds its own way." She didn't respond. She just stared at the broken barrier, her face pale with regret. A city car pulled up shortly after, followed by another official vehicle. Inspectors stepped out, carrying clipboards and tools. They approached her first, asking her to explain what happened. She struggled to speak, stumbling over her words, pointing toward the debris. He watched from a distance, unsure if he would be called over. The inspectors examined the barrier, took measurements, and wrote notes. One of them noticed him standing in his yard and nodded for him to come over. "Did you see when the wall was built?" the inspector asked. He explained everything when the workers arrived. How she refused to listen to warnings, how the storm built up water behind the wall. The inspector listened carefully, writing everything down. "This could have been much worse," the inspector said. "She's lucky the water didn't damage more of the house." He nodded, glancing at her. She stood a few steps away, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her thoughts together. "We will issue removal orders," the inspector continued. "She'll need to clear all of this and restore the creek's natural path." Then he added, "It's unfortunate, but blocking a waterway always ends the same way." He thanked the inspector and returned to his porch. As he sat down, the sun finally rose fully over the neighborhood. Shining on the creek that had quietly caused such a big disaster, he felt tired, relieved, and sad all at once. The storm had taught her a harsh lesson, and he wondered how things would be between them from now on. For the first time since she moved in, he sensed she might finally understand something. He had been trying to tell her all along, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. And the next days would bring even more change. The morning after the storm, he woke up with a strange mix of hope and nerves. The sky was calm, the air cool, and the whole town felt washed clean. He stepped outside expecting the usual quiet, but instead he saw his neighbor standing near her yard, staring at the soaked ground with her arms crossed. She didn't say a word, and he didn't either. Both of them knew something had changed after the heavy rain, but neither wanted to talk about it. He checked the creek first. Water was still flowing, slower than usual, but it was steady. The rocks he had placed earlier had stayed in place, and the path he made for the water looked untouched. Everything seemed fine on his side, but when he glanced over at her yard, he noticed her fence leaning slightly, and the soil looked disturbed as if the ground had shifted during the storm. He didn't want to stare, so he pretended to be busy checking some branches that had fallen near his shed. As the morning passed, he tried to get back to his routine. He cleaned up small messes around the yard, removed broken twigs, and straightened some things that had been blown over. But while he worked, he felt eyes on him. Every few minutes, he caught her watching him from her porch or near the damaged fence, her face tight with frustration. It was clear she wasn't just angry about the fence. Something else was bothering her, but he couldn't guess what yet. Around midday, he walked into town to grab a few supplies. The storm had knocked out power in some areas, and people were out talking about flooded lawns, fallen trees, and blocked ditches. A few neighbors mentioned hearing water rushing loudly the night before, louder than any storm they had heard recently. Someone even said they saw water spilling over the road near the edge of town. He listened, but didn't comment. He had enough to think about already. When he returned home, he noticed two workers standing near his neighbor's house. They were pointing at the side of the building, talking quietly and shaking their heads. She stood nearby, her arms folded tight across her chest, clearly irritated. The workers left a few minutes later, and she stormed back inside without acknowledging anyone. He didn't know what the problem was, but he sensed it had something to do with the storm's aftermath. Later that afternoon, while he was inside drinking water and resting, he heard a sudden splash outside. At first, he thought it was an animal near the creek, but when he stepped out, he froze. Water was pouring down the hill toward her home, not from the creek, but from somewhere behind her property. He walked closer, trying to see where the water was coming from. Then he realized the soil near the blocked side of the creek had started breaking apart again. The water, instead of flowing forward, was slipping underground and re-emerging near the foundation of her house. It wasn't a flood, not yet, but it was enough to make him call out to her. She came outside quickly, annoyed at first. But then she followed his gaze and saw the water pooling near her basement windows. She gasped and hurried over, looking panicked for the first time since all their arguments began. "Why is it doing that?" she demanded, though her voice sounded more scared than angry. He didn't answer right away. He knelt down, touching the wet ground. The soil was loose, and the water felt cold. Too cold for surface runoff. It had come from an underground pocket, likely caused by the creek being blocked earlier and pressure building up.
Ow.
"It's finding the easiest path," he finally said calmly. "Water always does." Gosh. She stared at him like she didn't know what to say. For once, she didn't snap back. She was silent, watching the water gather slowly. He looked around the yard and then pointed to the back corner. "We need to make a channel so it can drain out," he said. "If it stays here, it might start seeping inside." She hesitated, her pride still visible on her face. But fear was stronger now. She nodded stiffly. He grabbed a shovel from his shed, and she brought another one from her garage. They worked side by side, digging a narrow ditch from the pooling water toward a lower patch of ground. The soil was heavy and soaked, and their shovels kept getting stuck, but they didn't stop. It took nearly an hour before the water began slowly sliding through the new path. When it finally started draining away from her house, she let out a long breath. "Thank you," she said quietly. It wasn't much, but it was the first kind thing she had said in a long time. They stood there catching their breath, staring at the yard that now looked like a patchwork of mud and dugout channels. He could tell she wanted to say more, but before she could, a loud cracking sound echoed from behind her house. They both turned at the same time. One of the basement windows had bowed inward slightly. The soil around it was swollen with moisture, and water was dripping down the wall. She rushed to it, tapping the glass in panic. "Not again," she whispered. He frowned. "Has this happened before?" She didn't answer right away. After a moment, she looked down at the ground. "Last year," she said softly. "After a smaller storm, I thought it was a plumbing issue. I didn't think it was the creek." That surprised him. She had known something was wrong long before they argued, long before she blocked off the creek. A quiet realization settled over him, but he didn't want to confront her with it. Not now. He inspected the window and saw that the pressure wasn't strong enough to break it. But if there was another burst of underground water, it could get worse. "You should get someone to check your basement soon," he said gently. She nodded, still shaken, and went back inside. Evening came slowly. The sky turned pink, then orange, and finally a deep purple. He sat on his porch, tired from the long day, drinking tea and watching the quiet yard. Things felt different. Not fixed, not settled, but different. The tension between them had shifted into something uneasy yet calmer. But just as he thought the day was ending peacefully, he heard distant thunder. A low, rolling sound, far away but unmistakable. He looked at the sky. Dark clouds were coming again, creeping in from the west. It wasn't supposed to rain tonight. A heavy feeling settled in his chest. Another storm was on the way, and the ground behind her house was already weakened. The water hiding beneath the soil was unpredictable. He stood up, watching the clouds move closer. Tomorrow. Everything might change again. He just didn't know how much, and neither did she. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness in the air. It was the kind of calm that made a person feel uneasy, like the world was holding its breath. He woke up early, not because he wanted to, but because he hadn't slept well. The sound of thunder from the night before kept echoing in his mind, even though the storm never fully hit. Instead, it lingered somewhere in the distance, waiting, watching. He stepped outside and looked toward the sky. It wasn't raining, but the clouds were thick and heavy, hanging low like they were deciding whether to pour down or move on. The ground was damp, the air cool. The creek behind his house flowed normally, but after everything that had happened in the past 2 days, he didn't trust the calm. He walked toward the boundary between his yard and his neighbor's. Stopping near the spot where they had dug the drainage channel the day before, it had helped at least for a while, but water had pooled again overnight. Not as much as before, but enough to worry him. The soil was soft, too soft. He heard a door open behind him and turned. She stepped outside slowly, wrapped in a long sweater, looking tired but calmer than he expected. "Maybe she didn't sleep either, is it bad?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not yet. But if the rain comes back, it might get worse." She sighed and looked down at the ground. For once, she didn't have that sharp, defensive tone. She seemed more worn out than anything. "I called someone to check the basement later today," she said. "They can't fix anything, but they can at least tell me what's happening." "That's good," he replied. They stood in silence for a moment. For the first time since she had moved in, there was no anger between them, no tension. Just two people dealing with something bigger than either of them wanted. As the morning went on, the sky grew darker. He tried to keep busy as stacking firewood, checking the gutters, making sure everything around his home was ready in case the weather changed. Every few minutes he found himself glancing at her house, listening for signs of trouble. By noon, the wind started picking up. Leaves blew across the yard, and the trees swayed. Small drops of rain fell here and there, but nothing heavy. It was the kind of warning rain that came before something stronger. At around 1 o'clock, a truck pulled into her driveway. She rushed out to meet the worker who stepped out. He carried a clipboard and tools, and after a short talk, he followed her around the side of the house to check the basement area. He didn't mean to listen, but the worker spoke loudly. "This soil is unstable," the man said. "There's pressure building underneath. Water has been moving through this area for months." Months. He looked toward them, surprised. She glanced his way for a moment, looking embarrassed. The worker continued. "Whatever blocked the water didn't cause the whole problem, but it definitely made things worse. The pressure has nowhere to go now, so it's pushing right into the foundation." She closed her eyes briefly, as if she already knew that but didn't want to hear it out loud. The worker spent another 20 minutes checking the windows, the walls, and the ground. When he finished, he shook his head. "You're going to get water inside," he said plainly. "Maybe not today, maybe not in an hour, but it's coming. If we don't set up pumps and drains right now, it could fill your basement." She pressed a hand to her forehead. "How much will that cost?" He gave her a number that made her go silent. I'll figure something out," she said. Once the worker left, she remained outside for a long time, staring at the house like it had betrayed her. He watched her from his porch, unsure if he should go talk to her. But after a few minutes, she noticed him watching. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than he had ever heard. He nodded and walked over. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look frustrated. She looked ashamed. "I should have handled things differently," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have blocked the creek. I shouldn't have yelled at you. I thought you were being difficult on purpose." He shook his head gently. I was just trying to keep the water flowing safely. That's all. I know, she whispered. Now I know. She looked toward the house again, her voice breaking a little. My son grew up here, you know. This place meant so much to him. When I moved back after he left for college, I wanted everything to look perfect. I didn't want the creek taking away more land. I didn't want the yard to change. I thought I could control it. You can't control water, he said quietly. It finds its own path. She nodded. Yeah, I'm learning that the hard way. Before either of them could say anything else, thunder cracked sharply in the distance. They both looked up. Rain began to fall slow at first, then faster, then steady. He felt his stomach drop. Come on, he said, grabbing his jacket. Let's check the basement. She followed him quickly, and they rushed to the back of her house. Rain hit the ground hard now, splashing against the windows and turning the soft soil into mud. Water trickled down the walls, slipping into the cracks. They reached the basement door, and she fumbled with the handle before finally getting it open. The moment the door swung open, they saw it. A thin line of water sliding across the floor. She gasped and covered her mouth. It's happening, she whispered. He looked around quickly. We need towels, buckets, anything to slow it down until the pump arrives. She ran upstairs and he stepped inside, trying to block some of the water with old boxes stacked near the wall. But the flow grew stronger. The storm outside intensified. Rain pounding on the ground above like hundreds of small hammers. She returned with towels, mops, and a bucket. They worked fast, trying to push the water toward the drain in the center of the basement. But the water kept coming, slowly, steadily, unstoppable. Within 20 minutes, the thin line had become a wide sheet covering half the floor. She looked close to tears. I can't believe this. I can't. I don't know what to do. He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're not alone. We'll get through it. Another loud rumble of thunder echoed. The electricity flickered. They froze. A second later, the lights went out. The basement went dark except for the small window, where the storm clouds pressed against the glass. The storm outside roared louder, and the sound of rushing water filled the house. He turned on his phone flashlight. Shining it across the basement floor, the water level had risen again faster this time. She stepped back, shaking. It's getting inside faster than we can clean it. He nodded slowly. We need to get out of here. It's not safe to stay down. They rushed upstairs and closed the basement door behind them. The house creaked under the pressure of the wind and rain. Outside, the yard had become a shallow pond. She stood near the window, watching the muddy water swirl. This is all my fault, she whispered. It's nature, he said gently, and maybe a few choices made it worse. But this isn't the end of your home. It can be repaired. She wiped her eyes. Why are you helping me? After everything I did. He paused, thinking for a moment. Because we're neighbors, he said softly. Because we live next to each other. And because someday I might need help too. Something in her expression softened, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Hours passed. The storm continued, then slowly weakened. By evening, the rain finally stopped. The clouds thinned. The sky lightened. She opened the basement door again, hesitant. Water covered the floor, several inches deep. But it wasn't as bad as it could have been. The new drainage path they had made the day before must have relieved some pressure. She looked at the mess without crying this time. We can clean this, she said quietly. He nodded. Yes, we can. In the days that followed, they worked together. Pumps arrived. The basement dried. Workers repaired damaged soil. The creek returned to its natural path. Something else changed too. She stopped treating him like an enemy. She visited his porch sometimes, bringing coffee or asking for advice. One morning, as they walked near the creek, she said, I guess Mother Nature gave me a lesson I won't forget. He smiled gently. She usually does. And from that day on, the neighborhood felt a little quieter, a little kinder, and a lot more connected than before.